morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to 1% Better, the podcast where we take a look at hidden stories in sport. Today's episode is another bonus episode in our energy series with Aitor Viribay. We are talking all about carbohydrates today. So again, we really appreciate you all joining us for these bonus episodes. We're hoping you're enjoying them. Please do let us know. Do send us a DM on Instagram. You can email us if you'd like to. You can comment on YouTube. You can comment on Spotify as well. All those things are helpful feedback for us, obviously helpful to the algorithm if they're public, things like Spotify comments, YouTube comments, etc. And share the podcast as well. Tell people, share this with people who would find it to be helpful. So that does help us grow. That helps us. Helps Aitor. Tells him that you've enjoyed his work there and makes it worth his while. So we really do appreciate all that from you and from him as well. So today's episode, as I mentioned, carbohydrates. Aitor was, and we sort of talk about this a bit in the podcast. We talk about how Aitor was one of the first people to publish on this, right? Now, so we've been using 120 grams an hour for a while, or some people have been. We haven't been. Oh, I haven't been. Maybe you have. But Aitor was one of the first people to publish a paper on this, and we talk about why and how he got to that point and what he found in that paper. And he sort of started off this more academic means there, and he talks about the fact that it was probably happening before then anyway, and so how he got to that point. So that is one of the things we talk about. We talk about why carbohydrates are important, how to use them, etc. Differences between glucose and fructose, all of those things there. So this is basically your carbohydrate 101. And if you are then looking for fueling products as a result of this, of course, Precision Fuel and Hydration sponsor the podcast. We're very appreciative to them. We do have a discount to be used over there at Precision Fuel and Hydration. That discount code is BETTER, all in capital letters, 2026. That will get you 15% off your first order. In addition to that, you can just follow one of the links that we have in our show notes. Those will automatically apply that code to your order if you do then place one. But those things you can do on the website or those links lead you to either the fuel and hydration planner if you're not sure how to use carbohydrates and, for that matter, electrolytes and fluids. Similarly, you can actually book a call with one of their sports scientists to go through all of this. And again, both of those are obligation free. It's just something that Precision does that I think is great from them because it can be messy, right? You listen to this podcast, you hear Aitor speak, 120 grams. How does it apply to me? What should I do? Is it 60? Is it 90? How do I do this? What about different intensities? Do I need to do that in training? All those things. So do go check them out. That'd be really helpful to us. It'd be helpful to you, hopefully, and it would certainly be helpful to Precision. So we do appreciate their support, and we'd encourage you to support them. Similarly, Stryd sponsor us. They have been sponsoring us for right around a year now. We do really appreciate their sponsorship as well. So do go check Stryd out. They make running power meters, but I use them for much more than that. So of course, there's the power aspect to it. There are all sorts of gait kinematic information that comes from that. You can look at how your body's behaving like a spring, which I talked about previously. You can look at ground contact times, how much you're staying on the ground. And the thing that I found most interesting with all this stuff is not necessarily the ultimate values, but how they change. How do they change with fatigue? How do they change? And that, when I talk about fatigue, I'm talking about within a week. So am I more fatigued here or there? How's my gym affecting my running and how I'm feeling? Then also, more importantly, how they decay across a run. And should I be cutting these runs short or risking something in terms of some potential overuse type of injuries there because I'm decaying in my form so much. So I found that to be interesting, particularly if you're a bit worried about the gym. I reckon and you're feeling a bit like, I'm a bit sluggish today. Like some of these metrics are, again, objective ways to quantify these things. So perhaps there's a way for you to see, hey, what I felt was right, or maybe I just feel like that, but I'm actually moving quite well. So do go check Stryd out. Thank you to them as well for supporting the podcast. And without further ado, let's get to Aitor and let's talk all things carbohydrates. Aitor Viribay is the Global Sports Performance Director at Salomon, a consultant exercise physiologist at Girona Football Club, co-founder and chief scientific officer at Lab to Field, co-founder and researcher at MedHub, and founder and director at Glut4Science. Aitor joins us today for episode 3 of the Energy series. So do go back and check out our first 2 episodes. This will, of course, stand by itself, but I do think there's a lot of value in going back and hearing that, including Aitor's full bio, not just the brief one we gave today. So the first 2 were on building a performance environment, which I think sets the fundament for this all. And then we talked about energy expenditure. And so we're kind of drilling down more and more. And again, the central theme of all this is about energy and energy expenditure. So how initially it's about how do we conserve it and where is it used in an athletic environment? Then it's about how does it get used? And then today is about carbohydrates, probably the source of most energy for most athletes most of the time when it comes to racing, certainly, maybe not in training and maybe not in day-to-day life. But Aitor, welcome back.
Thank you, David. Hello. How are you doing?
I'm well, mate. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Yes, leaving behind some camps with the team, so finally at home, and good to be here on the podcast with you.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you again. We really appreciate your time, particularly given how busy you are. I think we should start here, and this may be a little bit basic, but why are carbohydrates important for endurance performance? I think that sets the scene nicely.
And that's probably a hard question to answer. Easy or hard? The easiest questions sometimes are the hardest one to answer. But well, carbohydrates, they are probably the one of the most efficient source of energy for the body. And when you can, of course, exercise is very wide kind of term, and it depends on the intensity and relative intensity and duration. But I think we can say that carbohydrates and how they are reduced into glucose and then lactate, and that kind of carbon source for the mitochondria. They make absolute. I mean, they are absolutely determinant in any kind of intensity range of the exercise, but most importantly when you're running long and as kind of medium or high intensities. So I could say they are the most predominant kind of or the most determinant fuel for the exercise.
And most people wouldn't know this, or maybe they do, because I mentioned it on the podcast and we do have our listeners here, but you were the lead author on probably the paper that lit the fire of this 120 grams an hour that we are seeing today, right? So you were ground zero to some extent. So you looked at, and correct me if I'm wrong, you looked at 120 grams an hour in a mountain marathon and showed reduced markers of energy of muscle damage the next day. That's my memory serves me correctly. So why did you decide on 120 grams per hour? Because it's a little bit of I wouldn't say it's a black swan, but it's almost, in hindsight, now it seems inevitable. But, at the time, we were kind of the science hinted at the fact that more than 90 grams an hour wasn't really, I don't want to say possible, but wasn't going to be used.
Yeah, well, I mean that there is a good history. Sorry, there is a good story behind that, and as you said, back in the days, science was very kind of very clear, and also kind of leaving no space for thinking, out of that box. Like certainly, it was there is a very solid evidence that 90 grams per hour can represent a real limit on mostly absorption, definitely not on oxidation, because everybody was reporting higher oxidation, and everybody could report that, but on the absorption rates of exogenous carbohydrates. Back on those days, I was even before this study, I was bike rider myself, and I was exploring on my own body, and I was definitely fueling more than 90 grams per hour, so already kind of experimenting that on my own body. And then I met some of researchers and authors that you can read on that paper, and they were already kind of investigating on that or researching on that high rates of exogenous carbohydrate fueling, and I was integrated into that study. But just to summarize, I mean, even if the science was very clear on the 90 grams per hour, we were already not only trying on ourselves, but also reporting higher intakes on those professional cyclists, trail runners, road runners that we were working with. So it was kind of I mean, why is this gap here, and why the science cannot explain what is happening in the reality? And as simple as that, then that was decided. So we studied this study, and we ended up with some good results we were expecting. Of course, you always expect like higher, like faster times in the finish line, and very big kind of performance gains and all that. And what we saw, I mean, definitely, even if you look into the paper, there wasn't scientific or statistical significance, but the differences between the three groups, they were quite substantial, especially if you bring them into a real time kind of interpretation. 30 seconds, 1 minute is big difference. Although in
Yep.
science, sometimes averaging is not always significant, but mostly we saw a lot of interesting results on the catabolism, and the preservation on the muscle function, integrity and function, because something that we also reported, and that was probably a good baseline for the future research that are probably coming, is how fueling high rates of carbohydrates during the exercise not only helps you on that day, on that moment, that exercise kind of boat, but also on recovering and potentially next day and 2 or 3 days. So we reported very good recovery with higher intake of carbohydrates. On those who were fueling 120, they showed significantly lower muscle damage, and most importantly, the next day, improved neuromuscular function and also improved performance on a kind of time to exhaustion um, test. So yeah, we you are right. We started kind of, we opened up a little bit kind of that window of, there is something here, it can be explored, and that probably became with this revolution of sport nutrition, hydrogels coming, more people fueling more or higher amounts, and that kind of created like a perfect storm. And probably back in the days, I wasn't aware of that, but now looking back into that, I said, wow, we were a little part of that, and yeah, honestly, I think we have to be proud of that as well.
Yeah, you've got to be really proud. And I guess maybe let me set the scene for some listeners. So, historically, if you look at the carbohydrate research, there were some thoughts that 60 grams was the upper limit. That was really representing glucose more than anything else. Then we started adding fructose as well because there's a different transporter through the gut. We ended up then seeing a ceiling closer to 90 grams in a mixture of 60 grams of glucose and 30 grams of fructose. But as we go up to 120, that starts to become closer to a 1:1 ratio. Is that fair to say, Aitor?
That's fair to say. That science was, or those limits kind of reported in the science, they were exactly as you said, limited by the absorption. So and probably even if we go back like 60 years, then that carbohydrate intake has been evolving and increasing slowly as we know more about how the human body absorbs carbohydrates. So we started on, if you look into those studies, when they started doing kind of biopsies, they were experimenting with 20, 30 grams per hour of glucose only. Probably that increased up to 60. Then the fructose came in, then the multidextrin or maltodextrin came in as well, and that opened new possibilities into studying that energy provision. And so we ended up with this, yeah, probably in the thousands. That was 60 grams per hour. That was the norm. And then with the integration of fructose, there's some elegant studies on Jokendrup and, those classic studies that we all learned with that, the famous 60 grams of glucose plus 30 grams of fructose, I would end up with 90. And then by doing that, you kind of, you bypass that limit of absorption that the glucose is normally around 1 gram per minute, so that's 60 um, grams per hour, and the fructose on 30, so that's 0.1 grams per minute on those different kind of transporters that we know, the SGLT1 that is sodium dependent, and the fructose glut5. So all those things that I think we were very busy studying during the 2010, 2015, and even up to 2020, I think. And where we started exploring with 120, that definitely there were some previous as well, some previous kind of evidences as well. Different researchers studying even up to 180, but really not seeing something kind of interesting there. So that's where probably everything kind of changed a little bit, and now I would say we can not through studies, but I think individually we have reported higher amounts of absorption rates that are definitely bigger than 60 grams per hour for glucose, and also bigger than 30 grams per hour for fructose. So, I mean, 120, even higher amounts, they are possible. And of course, there is always a limit in the absorption capacity, mostly in the intestinal lumen, in intestinal cell. But probably those are not the same ones as we were kind of researching back in, 15, 20 years ago.
Well, you bring up a couple of really good points that I was going to highlight as well. So, firstly, the scientific process. The understanding of carbohydrates has evolved over a period of, let's call it decades, conservatively. It's probably longer than decades, probably measured in something longer than decades. And I think that's important for some of the future episodes we have. We're going to be talking about substrates like lactate, like ketones. We are so far differently paced in that. You know what I mean? Like the research in those areas is in its infancy, and I think it can be very quick to hold those substances to the standard we're holding carbohydrates to. When if we held carbohydrates to that standard 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it would look different. So I think that's the first thing: is our understanding is evolving, and it's evolving quickly. The second thing I'd say is you told a really good story there of like how things progressed, and one of the things there is our understanding of limiters. So, for instance, you mentioned the transporters in the gut, right? And I remember learning those in medical school and all that stuff. That was revolutionary at one point. And why this is important is because when we use carbohydrates, we have a physical ingestion, right? And then we need an absorption. Then it needs to get to where it needs to be used, and then it needs to be oxidized, right? And so there's all these different limiters along the way that can create different bottlenecks and different rate limiters in that respect. So part of the reason that the elites can probably hit 120 and have it be meaningful in a way that I can't, probably because my output isn't enough, right? And that's one other limiter that we just don't understand at some points, or we hadn't understood at some point. So I think all of that's really important in the context of some of this, particularly because later on, I'm going to ask you about a great blog post you have from a long time ago as an early pioneer in gut training. So we are going to get to that at one point. But I wanted to get back to the paper you mentioned, and you talked about 120 grams an hour, and you talked about the benefits the next day, and there are a number of them. The next day performance in terms of things like time to exhaustion makes complete sense in that you intook more now, therefore your deficit is less. It's basically energetics, right? It's almost like a pre-refueling. The question around the actual fatigue, that like neuromuscular damage and perhaps performance maintenance, is more complex than that, though, having talked to you previously. There's some stuff at the actual level of the muscle that I'd love you to explain to people when we're intaking more carbohydrate.
Yeah, and that's probably what we still don't understand properly, and probably I can say I have defined my way of understanding these effects, for the last 10 years, but still, there are a lot of things that we don't know about this, and we always used to understand carbohydrates as as a math or mathematical kind of problem, and back in the days we were calculating like, I've got 2,000 kilocalories in glycogen storage, and my race is going to take 2 hours, and I'm going to be depleted. But the reality is that the body doesn't work like that. And yes, there is a quantitative kind of dimension of carbohydrates. Of course, if you're spending two, you have to replace, at least, I'm not going to say two, but you have to replace something that you can still keep running and kind of um, reduce the emptying of your battery, if you want to call it that way. But most importantly, there is a qualitative kind of dimension on those effects in the body. Because, when we ingest carbohydrates, when we take a gel and we're exercising, it is not only that those 30 or 40 grams, they go to the body, through the intestinal digestive system, sorry, and it gets delivered into whatever, the muscle of your leg, and it gets oxidized there. It's not only that, it is also signaling what is happening. And there are a lot of sensors of energy in our body that are saying, 40 grams are coming, so I'm going to behave differently if they were not coming. Okay, so that's what I call the, and maybe it's wrong, but I don't find any way of summarizing this. Is that qualitative dimension of fueling carbohydrates, and that is very important. I think how you recover from one day to the next one, it is also dependent on, or it comes also from that qualitative kind of impact. The most, let's say, the best example of this is the neuromuscular function, or the nervous system function. So again, if we come back to, we have discussed this before, but if we come back to why you stop running, definitely it has nothing to do with emptying your energy stores. I mean, when you stop running, that you cannot run anymore, you still have plenty of energy on your body to keep running for minutes. You're stopping because there is someone up there, it's called the brain, who is the most expensive organ, and the selfish brain that says you're not going to run anymore, because if you keep running, the whole body is going to be in danger. And I think it's time to recognize also those studies that Tim Noakes back in days, put in place on, um, around the central governor or whatever. And that was probably on a different way on what determines performance. But I think, understanding the nervous system and its role on performance, basically, on how you keep running or you stop running, is absolutely essential at this point. Of course, everything is connected. I mean, the brain is going to make a decision when that local peripheral kind of status of that cell, of that muscle, it gets compromised, or when your mitochondria cannot meet the demands of energy transformation, etc., etc. So coming back to the point, the reason why I'm saying that is, what we learned with when we had to discuss, because at the end of the day, you get some results, and then you start learning when you start, writing the paper, and you start reading other references and what other people they have done before, and etc., etc. So we discovered that there is direct role between the glycogen, but also the glucose availability and the lactate availability on the nervous system. Okay, so we're gonna go to this probably later, but we not only fuel glucose and fructose to directly go into the mitochondria, but we mostly fuel glucose and fructose to produce more lactate in the body, and then the lactate does the magic somehow, because this that kind of player, that pivotal player, like the midfielder in the football game, that can do everything. And that brings you to a very high efficient environment for the exercise, for example. But what we saw is that, first of all, glycogen is not so you ingest glucose. Of course, that has an impact on glycogen, liver glycogen, muscle glycogen, and also your glucose availability in the bloodstream and how that is used. But that is not only quantitative. So, the amount of glycogen that you've got in the body impacts on how you contract muscle. So when you are depleted, you decline your muscle function, your muscle capacity to contract. Okay, so I think it is now it is possible to think that lower glycogen levels can induce more muscle damage. So there are some elegant studies on, some researchers like Ortenblad and Nielsen from the Nordic countries, I think it's from Denmark, but they saw that there is a correlation between lower glycogen, between the concentrations of glycogen and the muscle contraction. So when the glycogen, certain glycogens, because glycogen is heterogeneously stored in the cell in different locations, and is correlated with the capacity to contract. So when you deplete your glycogen, you're compromising your excitation contraction coupling, which is essentially how you contract the muscle. So if you're breaking down more muscle cells and you're creating muscle damage, what we normally measure with CKs or LDH in the blood, etc., of course that cell is going to be broken. So how you recover from that is going to take longer. First of all, you need to repair that tissue. Secondly, you need to repair the function. You need those GLUT4 to start working again, probably on the membrane, and then you start getting ready to absorb more glucose. So a broken cell is going to be less functional than a cell that is not broken. Okay, so simply by reducing that muscle break or muscle damage, then you're improving how you recover from that run. Okay, so in a race like whatever Tour de France, if that has a massive impact on how you recover from one day to another. That's one. I don't know if you want to recap a little bit on this, but that's one. And the second one is the neuromuscular function per se. So what we know as well is the nervous system, it loves glucose and it loves lactate, and most especially lactate. I mean, lactate is the preferential source of energy for the nervous system. So we found some studies in animals, and now after 10 years, we can also find some others in humans, that when glucose is more available around the cell, and that means that lactate is also more available, that kind of electrical impulse, so that command on you're going to activate this and you're going to release the calcium from the sarcoplasmatic reticulum, and then you're going to contract muscle, that function is better. So we kind of make that hypothesis back in the days that potentially having more glucose available and therefore more lactate available in the cell could also improve that muscle contraction and that muscle function, which is the neuromuscular union. But on top of that, of course, we know that when you're running, the demands of the nervous system, the brain, is they are up to the roof. It's very, very expensive to sustain that kind of electric energy that you have to transform. So I also suspect that when you are fueling very high rates of carbohydrates during your exercise, and you are bringing to the limit not only the muscle but also the whole nervous system, the brain is also getting fueled, but it's also getting fed, sorry, by those carbohydrates and that glucose. So that probably, in my opinion, that's what could lead to improve maybe cognitive function, and therefore overall kind of performance capacity. And most importantly, the day after, where the nervous system, we know, is the most complex system to recover. It's not something that you eat and that's it. No, it requires some time. So I think it's more about something that we learn, and I'm gonna wrap up this point with this: is we probably learned that you're not only fueling for today, but what you fuel during the exercise. And now we can go into why, but what you fuel during the exercise is preventing you from depleting yourself and destroying yourself somehow for the next day. So, and that was something that, in my opinion, changed as well all the fueling practices in races like Tour de France.
Yeah, because there's a real simple. I think what you've underscored there is the really simple take is, oh, I'm having 160 grams today, so that in my recovery I have to eat less, and that is a real thing because eating is at that level. Eating is fatiguing, and these guys don't have a lot of time and all those things, right? So there's certainly that aspect to it, but I think the neuromuscular aspect is one we're going to learn more and more about, and that's what you're alluding to. I also wanted to highlight something for people because I think we've been on this podcast and in general explaining things to non-scientists. We've been pretty reductionist, and I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about this podcast in terms of me particularly explaining things. But we talk about there are two stores of glycogen, right? There's liver and there's muscle, and that's the first categorization, right? Is we have glycogen and it's stored in predominantly two spots: muscle and liver. But in the muscle, we have then subsections of glycogen that serve different roles. And then similarly, you've alluded to already, within the cell, we also have different aspects of glycogen. So when we get to muscle glycogen and its subpools, etc., they act hyperlocally. The whole thing with muscle glycogen is all about local supply. And that then speaks to we never really deplete all glycogen, we deplete pools that are relevant. And that's really important because it's also at this stage, we talked about science and the way it develops, a really difficult thing. And one of my hot takes is that our understanding of all this stuff is going to change in a stepwise quantum leap fashion when we have a better technique than muscle biopsy. Because at this stage, muscle biopsy is how we've understood things. And that is literally we rip out a muscle fiber and have a look at it. Now, the problem with that is we can't rip out the same muscle fiber twice. And so we don't really understand things that well. We have some understanding, but I think at a point where we can somehow label glycogen and use an MRI or something like that, everything will change for us. And that may be hyperbolic, but I don't think so. I think it will change our understanding wholesale.
No, no, that's correct, and also that helps us understanding that the human body is more complex than what we probably think. But you can even find glycogen in the brain. The
Yep.
astrocytes are these kind of helpers, kind of cells to the neurons. They also store some glycogen. There's a very little amounts, but this paper that I like from Ortenblad and Nielsen is called glycogen function, I think, and it says location, location, location. I mean, everything is about location and where it is, because the function is completely different, and that happens. And I love this example that I always use. It's the same with fat, with the how we store fat. And I use this always this example of a slide of jamón ibérico,
Yep.
the Iberic ham.
I know it very well. It's
Yeah.
my
So
favorite thing. There are two things I want to eat
ex-
every time I get to where your part of the world. One is
exactly,
Moni Iberico and one is Vichy Catalan. So
exactly. So
those are the two
the
things I must eat there. Of
the jamón, there are different qualities in the market. You can buy
course.
the most expensive one, and that looks completely different to the most kind of cheap one, the cheapest one. And the main difference that you can see just by looking into both of them is how kind of the white kind of, I don't know how to say that in English, but the white lines,
Yeah.
you can probably only find them in the expensive one, and that's the intracellular lipids, lipid
Yep.
droplets. That's the intramuscular triglycerides that, for whatever reason, and I'm going to explain now, that pork has, and the cheapest one doesn't have. Normally, on the cheapest one, you could see kind of the meat in the middle, and those kind of peripheral, line of fat. You know, that's exactly the same analogy. If we take a slice from Christian Blumenfeld's kind of a Thai muscle, or someone with a metabolic syndrome. It's all about location. The reason why that expensive, jamon iberico has a lot of fat inside and is very tasty is because that pork is not only eating certain kind of quality of food, but also most importantly because it's moving. It's moving a lot during his life, and that creates those adaptations that the fat, which is a very valuable source of energy, is very close to mitochondria. So it makes it very, very valuable. Whereas the other pork that is probably not moving and is kind of this mass production of they've got their own these kind of little cells or not cells, sorry, but yeah, well, not free in the mountains.
Yep.
That probably has no adaptations on having or using fats as an energy source for the exercise. So glycogen, fat is exactly the same. So how location and where it is displayed, that's adaptations, and that's something that we always have to consider.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So this may seem silly as a question, but I think it's important we discuss it. So we talked about energy expenditure, and we just talked about, in a previous episode, we just talked about fat there. Why are we so focused on carbohydrates in performance then? I know this is a very basic question, and the answer is pretty simple, but I think it's really important that we underscore this question. So why
Yeah,
the focus on
absolutely.
carbohydrates and not on fat or protein?
Good. Yeah, let me come back to energy. I prefer using energy transformation rather than expenditure because we
Sure. Yeah.
transform energy. I think we cannot avoid the fact that the fats are probably the most efficient source of energy when it comes to energy transformation. I mean, the amount of energy that you can get back from 1 gram of fat is a little bit more than double that glucose. So that's the reason why, of course, any endurance athlete has to, and probably they have a lot of adaptations to use and that's a determinant factor of performance. But that's only part of the story because fat utilization, fat oxidation, or energy conversion from fats is limited, and is limited basically based on the oxygen availability. Okay, so you can only use fats very well, let's say, on the maximum efficiency when you've got a lot of oxygen available, or when your mitochondria is really not the demands are not exceeding the delivery of that oxygen. Okay, so that might be something like whatever below LT1 or VT1 or whatever you want to call it, but kind of that low to slightly moderate kind of intensity. Even at those intensities, we still use a lot of glucose, and we still use that as a kind of as a source of energy. But yeah, we can definitely understand and we can agree that at those intensities, fats are definitely more predominant, and when it comes to energy efficiency, they are more efficient. The problem is that there are very few sports where everything is decided at those intensities. Okay, so even if you've got a very very high VT1, your sport is going to be decided by your capacity to go harder. Okay, and nowadays, even what it, you know 20 years ago they were considered endurance sports like ultra trail or UTMB. What we now know is that they are defined by the speed, and they go very fast. I was the other day just discussing with some of the very young athletes at Salomon that you have to run 330 and 340 in UTMB as well. And
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
if your VT1 is at 330, but with the fatigue, with the heat, with the etc., etc., you are on your red zone even at UTMB.
Well, 10 years
So
ago, 10 years ago, I crewed someone who got fifth in the women's race at UTMB. She passed somebody in the town of Chamonix, and that person was running 3:30 per kilometer. And
exactly,
this is kilometer 171. She was running.
exactly,
She had to be running faster than 3:30, and I tell you now, her VT1 was much lower than 3:30.
yeah,
So it's a perfect example. Is her position there was solely decided by her ability to run fast late in the race, and so we need
exactly.
to preserve that.
So you reach that limit where the fat contribution to energy transformation is not enough, and then the oxygen becomes to be less available, and then you need to switch into something that is more efficient, which are definitely carbohydrates and glucose, and most importantly lactate. So glucose and glycolysis is there. We always used to like partitioning kind of way of understanding things, but we know that there is a continuum kind of a use of both pathways, and they are continuously kind of working even at rest. You're not only exclusively transforming energy from fats, and not even only from fats and glucose, but also amino acids as well. Okay, um, or protein, let's say. But there is a point where you reach that kind of capacity of the fats that even on the highest rates of oxidation is reported around whatever. Even those who say that even they have measured 2 grams per minute, which you can argue if that is an artifact of the measurement or not. But let's imagine that is good. The amount of calories that provides is limited compared to the amount of calories that someone has to transform to keep 500 watts on the bike, for example. So, you know, just by using that substrate is not enough, and that's where glucose, glycolysis, carbohydrates, they come into the game, into the table to say, okay, we've got more efficient, more efficiency, higher efficiency when oxygen is not that available, and we can have faster energy, and then we can expand our energy kind of contribution to higher amounts of calories than fats alone. Okay, so this is not about only carbohydrates, only fat. This is about using predominantly one or the other, but always together when it is more efficient for the body. Okay, so let's imagine that we are on that kind of endurance or metabolic test, and we arrive there to VT1, and probably we're going to see that there is an activation on the glycolysis. That means that the body has to shift into using more glucose, and that actually glycolysis rate is increasing because the demands down in the mitochondria are higher, and they cannot only be met with fat oxidation. And that's where you keep progressing, and that is getting more and more kind of predominant. And there's a point where, because of different elements or different kind of mechanisms, but also because of the lactate production, that fat oxidation is going to be inhibited. Okay, so you're going to basically use only carbohydrates. So right now, taking into account the amount of energy that these high elite endurance athletes they have to transform, let's say 500 watts when Tadej Pogacar is climbing Col de la Lotte, whatever, that is not possible without optimizing glycolysis right now. I mean, just by doing simple calculations, if 500 watts means 25 kilocalories per minute of energy transformation, I cannot see an scenario where you can meet them only with fats. It's impossible. So that's where really the glycolysis, which is the use of carbohydrate, makes the real difference. And I used to explain that on I actually made a thread on Twitter once when I learned this with Ineos, and by measuring, we were measuring a lot of metabolic tests and energy transformation rates as well, and I really reflected back on that, and I said, where the magic happens, it's really glycolysis. So that's the real difference, and as well, something that is misunderstood traditionally is that glycolysis is something that happens only when oxygen is not enough, but that's not the reality. So glycolysis can be even contributing in a higher extent than fat oxidation at medium intensities. So even when Tadej Pogacar, whoever is cruising on the peloton. They are whatever at or climbing pretty slow on a climb that might be 4.5 watts per kilo. They are still relying a lot on carbohydrates. Why? Because that gives you more efficiency. Because we have said it at the beginning that fat oxidation is or the use of fat. 1 gram of fat gives you a lot of energy back, more than glucose. But when oxygen is limited, the glucose is more efficient because it requires less oxygen to get the same energy than fats. So it's just about the context. Okay, so if you improve efficiency at 4.5 watts per kilo through aerobically using more or by oxidizing more lactate and more glucose that is coming from glycolysis, then you're really being much more efficient. And the best example of that is the marathon, for example, where efficiency is absolutely determinant because basically you're supposed to sustain 2 hours of, kind of exactly the same pace. And, you have to be on the highest rate of efficiency that you can. So what I want to say with this is right now, and probably also due to this knowledge on carbohydrate fueling, we have learned a way to keep very high rates of efficiency, of mechanical efficiency. And that makes kind of non-returning point into the fat oxidation kind of adaptation or whatever endurance sports right now. So just to give some numbers, and I finish with this. When these athletes, Tadej Pogacar or even whoever, Kylian Jornet, or they are running UTMB and they're racing the Tour de France at relatively low intensities for them. So VT1 or well, by the way, that VT1 can be maybe on 5.2 watts per kilo, which is
We're going to talk about
crazy.
this in a little while. The
Yeah,
difference
but
between absolute and relative intensities.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, relatively, but they should be very comfortable. They still use a lot of glucose. They oxidize a lot of glucose, and that can be up to 2.5 to 3 grams per minute, which is crazy. That means a lot of, 3 grams per minute. You can do the calculation per hour. It's 180 grams per hour. Okay, so that's also the reality of this human metabolism that we are studying right now during this kind of phase of the history. Because back in the days, of course, the metabolisms that they were studying, they were completely different. That's something that David Roche always summarizes really well when he talks about this revolution of carbohydrates, whatever. It's just different context. Right now, we know we can fuel 120. Then that's a different subject that we are studying. Someone who can almost not limitless, but in a considerably high quantities, provide more energy. Back in the days, it was not possible. So we also need to understand that difference between the human beings that we're studying right now and the human beings that we were studying back in, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah, those humans were running 2:07 marathons with a couple of licks of water and maybe a gel once, right? And that adaptation and metabolically is different to the human that's taking 120 grams an hour in terms
Correct.
of both how they achieve it and globally, right? So it's completely different. Not to mention, if we'd fed that 208 guy back in the 70s 120 grams an hour, his metabolism would be different. So
Correct.
I think I would, I want to clip that answer that you just gave us and send it to all undergraduates because part of this is just because the way we have to teach it because it's easier, right? The beginners understand in black and white and the experts understand in shades of gray, but so much of metabolism understanding is as though it's on and off. It's light switches. And I always say physiology is actually a dimmer switch. It's not a light switch. It's more or less, not all or nothing. We're always burning a little bit of fat. We're almost burning a little bit of carbs. How much is the percentages and where are they coming from and how we're going about that? So I think that's a really important point for people to understand. It's also really important to remember, again, this is how we teach it. We say, okay, creatine phosphate is what we use in a sprint, and then it goes into the glycolytic system, and then we go into fat burning, right? Once we go past a certain amount of time, call it an hour, then it's all fat, right? It's never always all. It's always all of them, never all or nothing, right? Particularly when we start to look at, if we look at UTMB or we look at the Tour de France, we say, okay, it's such an ultra endurance event, it's all fat, but it's actually not because it's not one long effort. It's many small high intensity efforts, more like interval training where it's more stochastic, and therefore your ability to switch between fat and carbohydrate is really important as is your ability to recover from those, right? So it's not necessarily what's your ability to have a maximal output, it's repeated maximal outputs and recovery and the durability of that on the back end. So I just wanted to underscore that for, perhaps people who are less versed in this area. The people who already understand metabolism really well will understand that inherently, but I think it's important to underscore that stuff. But we've just talked about the importance of carbohydrates and having, effectively what's called metabolic flexibility, which is the ability to burn fat at a high rate, burn carbohydrates at a high rate, switch between the two, and sort of have some level of what we'll call balance. Whether that is truly balanced is a different discussion. But how do you think about developing this? Is it about carbohydrate periodization or something else? How do you think about this?
That's a good question. I can probably not answer kind of on absolute terms. Um, I think metabolic flexibility is just one definition that we normally centralized on the muscle capacity to
Mm-hmm.
oxidize substrates, and definitely I think that it comes from down there, but it really explains a whole working function of the body. And as you said some minutes ago, you cannot, and we were already discussing this on the energy episode, you cannot transform energy. Sorry, you cannot absorb an energy that you're not capable of transforming.
Mm.
So first, you have to show capacities to transform energy, and then you have to, give that energy to the body. If you do the opposite, probably you get sick, or you gain weight, or whatever, and you even compromise more that metabolic function.
So to just
So
underscore this for listeners, what we're talking about here is kind of a push pull, right? So if
correct,
you can't just force feed yourself something and hope that your body burns it. We can't
exactly,
give we can't give you 160 grams an hour, even if you could absorb that out of your gut, even if that was possible for you. If we gave you 160 grams an hour and you were jogging, then you wouldn't be burning that, because even though we're pushing it in, your muscles don't need it. You need the muscles to pull as well. That's part of absorption, or at least as we understand it now, is that if you can burn more, insert here, you will therefore absorb more to some degree as well.
correct, and that, expanding that into the carbohydrate fueling field. I mean, of course, if I'm someone who barely moves and spend the whole day on the sofa, and my metabolic function is, or my mitochondrial flexibility is, or metabolic flexibility is very reduced, and I fuel 120 grams of sugar, that can be very, very risky. That can be very harmful for my health. But we don't need to fall on this kind of, misunderstanding and missing context. And that's something that you can definitely find, for example, in social media right now. We're not talking about that, but when you have the capacity to transform that amount of energy, absorb and oxidize those carbohydrates, then probably what we have seen, that's research and or other kind of researching groups that are also validating some of these effects, then those 120, 150, whatever, they are going to make the effect. But we cannot understand carbohydrate fueling without the context of the metabolic capacity, and that's the mitochondrial function or the metabolic flexibility. Now, how you get there, that's the $1 million question, and that's what we always try to do, because at the end of the day, we always want to improve the capacity of your athlete's mitochondria to convert more energy, because essentially, their performance relies basically on the capacity to transform energy, not only on the day of the race day, but the race day, sorry, but also on the preparation every day, so you can handle more volume, for example, and you can get more adaptations. So going to that question, I definitely don't see, and I don't suspect that fueling alone makes any impact on metabolic flexibility. So I couldn't like this to be taken as, if you fuel 120, you're going to improve your metabolic flexibility. It's not going to happen. But on the same way, it's not going to happen if you only fuel fats. I mean, nobody's going to get adaptations from eating exclusively avocados and oxidizing more fats. That is something that acutely happens in the body that is related to the availability. So if I don't have glycogen in my body, then my availability is very low because I've been following a keto diet. Of course, if you measure me right now, I'm gonna be oxidizing more fats. But simply because the body is reacting to that, what I've got, I'm gonna oxidize it more. But as soon as I come back to fueling carbohydrates, probably that is gonna come back to the previous balance. So, in my opinion, fueling per se or nutrition, and I'm a nutritionist, but I'm sorry to say that, but the impact that we've got on the metabolic flexibility, it is limited. And I don't want to say it's limited simply like, you know, it doesn't matter. No, no, no. But it has a secondary kind of role. But the first role, the main stimulus for the metabolism and most especially for mitochondrial function and metabolic flexibility, which is energy transformation, is movement. So the only way that one person is gonna improve the mitochondrial function, metabolic flexibility, is through movement. Now, what we can do from fueling point of view is, as you said, select the right availability for the right moment, the right availability of substrate or nutrition for the right moment, so we can, promote some adaptations or the others, or play with the energy kind of availability as well to potentially promote some adaptations or others. Okay, on that frame, definitely nutrition has a big impact because when you reduce your carbohydrate availability and you keep exercising, you are signaling a lot of processes of mitochondrial biogenesis. It's something that we know. If that is translated into major physiological adaptations, we still don't know. We still don't know. So right now, considering all my kind of years of experience plus the scientific literature, I mean, of course, every athlete, they have to do a little bit of everything always. I think every athlete has to train fasted sometimes, high carbohydrates on others, strength training, specific, less specific. That's non-negotiable. I'm not going to go into that discussion because, in my opinion, it's pointless. Because if you really want to get adaptations, you have to try and push your body on different kind of elements. For example, we know that dehydration that it doesn't produce any adaptations on hydration or dehydration. But I also think that sometimes you have to get dehydrated, of course, because that gives you perception of, for example, advantages, or it can help your body to sometimes react to something new. But when we talk about specific phase of the season where you want to promote mitochondrial function or metabolic flexibility, in my opinion, the volume and the right intensity selection of the exercise is the key. And from fueling point of view, we have to promote that. So if you are using a nutritional strategy that is compromising those two first elements, which is the volume that you can do over a week or over a month, and the intensity that you can deploy on your trainings, then probably you're going to be compromising your mitochondrial function. And that's the reason why, personally, going very extreme with low carbohydrate availability or even low energy availability, I've learned in the past that those two principles, volume and intensity, are compromised. Right now, I think the most efficient and the best way to promote those adaptations, plus don't compromise your health, is by strategically fueling carbohydrates based on different timings on the day. Because it is not the same to fuel 120 grams of sugar during the exercise, during the bike, or fueling that on the dinner plate. And that's, again, context. When you are moving, those carbohydrates, they don't need that much insulin, for example, when you are exercising, and that is going to go mostly directly into being oxidized. Whereas when you are kind of, having on the dinner, for example, your body is going to buffer those carbohydrates through insulin. So, in my opinion, right now, the carbohydrates are very useful because they can sustain the volume, they can sustain the intensity, and those are the main drivers of metabolic flexibility. But of course, on that, you have to prioritize carbohydrates because you don't, not every day you're exposed to, you're not exposed every day to high demands of energy and high demands of glucose. So, of course, naturally, you could periodize carbohydrates. If you're on a rest day or if you're on a long day where you're not going to be using high amounts of high rates of glucose oxidation, then definitely you need to periodize them. But I just want to make it very clear that every nutritional strategy, in my opinion, should, especially on the critical phase of the season, so the specific preparation of the season, it has to promote or it has to serve to keep the right volume, the right intensity. And if by using a nutritional strategy you're compromising those two, in my opinion, you're not going to improve your mitochondrial function or metabolic flexibility.
Yeah, exactly. I think the two things I want to highlight for people there is that you've got a very clear hierarchy in your mind: volume and intensity rule, and then we can talk about modifying things around that because they're the two primary factors. And I think it's really, I mean, firstly, I love that sort of thinking because it shows an organized mind, and that's something that really I appreciate in general. So I think it's important to have a hierarchy there, and people may disagree with you, and that's fine. I mean, I agree with you, but like the key here is understanding and making decisions based on a hierarchy as soon as possible, so that people can really understand the way to execute things. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight for people is you talked about like dehydration, and people might say, "Oh, that's that's a bad thing." I would argue that the key there is you're going to have a time where you're going to run into a problem with water. It's going to be leaking, or you're going to make a mistake. I made a mistake in a race once and filled the wrong flask, ended up without water. You need to be ready for that and understand that you can cope with it. You may be running out of fuel. You may have GI issues. You may be sick. So when we talk about top performance, that's one aspect. But when we talk about performance bandwidth, so the difference between your best and your worst day, this is about capping downside and about lifting the potential flaws. So, I know for a fact if something happens to Killian's pack and he drops all of his food, he'll be fine because Killian's done days and days and days of training fasted for whatever reason because Killian was doing what Killian was doing. That's very different to somebody who's never gone without a gel every 30 minutes, even psychologically. So I think that's really important. So yeah, I think that's it's crucial for us to understand that and to use those factors. I've got a couple more questions for you here, Aitor, if you've still got time. Is that okay?
Can I say, yeah, I've got time for that.
Yeah.
Can I say something before you go into those questions? But I mean, I don't know why, and something I'm trying to figure out in life. The human being, we always want not only answers, but we want, well, first of all, those answers that benefit us. That's one kind of
Of
characteristic.
course. Yes,
But the
yes,
second
yes.
one is those answers that they explain everything. And in my opinion, you only have you can only follow the track of metabolism to really understand what you need. And in performance, that's the demands of that race or that event. I mean, you're gonna prepare complete difference here final in the trail kind of a space or cocodona. And on top of that, then you have to consider your own environment, on your own context, or metabolic kind of capacities. As you said, if I'm someone who just started in trail running, or if I've been doing this forever and I'm already on certain levels of chronic adaptations. So I could say, and maybe it is disappointing because the human brain wants answers and solutions, but in my opinion, you can only, I mean, there's some answers that you can only get them from deeply understanding the metabolic demands of whatever you are exposed to. And, there's no more than that, in my opinion. You can discuss here, your carbohydrates are better or worse or whatever, but at the end of the day, it depends on the real, on the context and the metabolic environment.
Yeah, and that's why you work with professionals. That's why you have a job to some degree, right? Like, and that's a
Good.
good thing. No, it's a good thing, not a bad thing. I wanted to
Yeah.
talk about a carbohydrate that mostly people don't talk about, and I think you have a great appreciation for and a great emphasis on. It's fiber. Most people think of it as a non-carbohydrate, but let's talk about fiber in the context here, because I think most people probably go towards low fiber approaches, or think about fiber in terms of low fiber, because that's what we do, say, a couple of days out of a race for
Yeah.
lots of reasons, including GI stress and GI risk. How do you think about fiber in a context of an athlete who needs to have high training loads, high energy demands, high carbohydrate demands, but also needs to have a level of health, outside of that?
Um, well, as we discussed, I think in the first episode, I think there's never going to be performance if that athlete, that person is not healthy. But going further, there's never going to be high fueling capacities, so absorption rates, if your gut is absolutely healthy. So if you continuously fuel only sugars, not only your overall health is going to get compromised, but most importantly, your gut function is going to get compromised. So fiber, and fiber probably represents just only one thing, but it means that space of macro, micro, and other nutrients that help us being healthy are absolutely necessary. And they're non-negotiable in high endurance athletes. They're non-negotiable even in the Tour de France, in my opinion. Okay, and that's where also I think the high fueling during the exercise makes a real, makes sense. And I'm going to try to explain this. Some people they try to put us some kind of fear on the carbohydrate and simple carbohydrate, saying that they inflammate you. You're gonna go into this kind of redox state, and you're gonna be inflamed, and they're gonna ruin, sorry, like fuck up basically your um, digestive system, etc. That's not going to happen if your body can buffer that. That's not going to happen, and that doesn't happen really if your body is healthy enough to sustain those rates. And of course, if you are applying this proportionality in terms of fueling capacities. So right now, fiber is something that has to be always there in someone's kind of nutritional kind of a plan on a daily basis. The problem is, as you said, if I have to place fiber on my bottles and on my gels, because during the exercise my gut function is compromised, I'm probably that's not going to help me. So we need to somehow get, not always, but mostly on those medium intensity or high intensity days, we need to remove the fiber out from that kind of training session or those moments. So we need to place them before or after. And when you go to a race and you want to optimize to the maximum level that absorption capacity and of absorption efficiency, then maybe you have to displace a little bit the fiber for 1 or 2 days. But eating fiber, probiotics, leaf, live compounds like ferments, etc. That's non-negotiable. For me, it's more about when and where in the day you place them. And there is something that we cannot avoid, which is high endurance athletes, high elite endurance athletes. They have very high energy demands. If you don't meet them, you're going to go into what we call the energy deficit. And we already explored what that looks like and the impacts on that, the impact of that on the body. So energy constraint or metabolic constraint, and then your body goes into defense mode, etc., etc. So you still have to eat whatever 5,000 calories. You cannot do that always with fiber because that means eating tons load of food. So we are using, and that was initially kind of the idea as well, because there is a window during the exercise that you don't need that much insulin and the environmental conditions they allow fueling. You can use fueling during the exercise with low fiber, so gels, bars, etc., rice cakes, whatever, as a way to help you meeting those demands. So then you can really use fiber. But just imagine this scenario where you don't fuel during the ride at all, 5 hours, and you just fuel whatever 30 grams per hour, and then you still have to meet the overall demands of the day. So that means that you have to eat, a shitload of food on your breakfast and your dinner. And on top of that, you have to do it with fiber. That means the amount of volume of food that you have to eat is simply impossible. And probably you're going to end up with energy deficit. So fueling during the exercise, during the intensity, especially during moderate to high intensity, it is for me a way to also protect that kind of fiber intake of the bike, on those of the exercise, if you want to call it that way, of the bike, we say in cycling. So you can really keep kind of heterogeneous, with high variety kind of nutrition and diet that is absolutely necessary to perform. So even in the Tour de France, when I joined in, I remember, I said, no, we're going to eat legumes. We're going to eat whole foods in the Tour de France. Why? Because if you compromise that, then the gut function is going to be easily compromised in a matter of 3, 4, 5, 7 days, and the Tour de France is a whole month. So there's no way I can ask you to fuel 120 if your gut, if your microbiota, if your overall health is not perfect. So you cannot understand high fueling of carbohydrates without understanding the overall kind of generic health of the body.
I love that. I think it's that's really, really salient. Aitor, you've got a heart out here, so I'm going to leave it here. But what I will direct people to, this blog post that I mentioned before on gut training, it's exceptional. It's got a great how-to paradigm. I've got a link to it in the show notes, so I would direct people to go there. Most of your GLUT4 work is in Spanish. This is not, thankfully, because even then people who don't speak Spanish like me can understand.
Yeah.
So we will leave it be. But what it does, like high level, it certainly talks about different factors that play into gut training in terms of both ingestion versus not, high versus low intakes. It does basically volume as well as a consideration. I think people often talk about carbohydrate amounts, like how much carb should I eat to train my gut, but I think there's a component of things like volume of food in there, or food at all, or fluids. So I think it's a really good resource. It really changed my view on things, so I would direct people there.
Let me say, sorry, David, please be soft with me, because that post was posted back in, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago or 6 years ago.
Well, I've
I
read
could
it
say,
recently. I've read it recently. I reckon it stands up today.
yeah, and I would say probably it is still is valid, but I'm sure I could change some things. But I think it's a very, very good baseline to understand that. So, but yeah, just be aware of
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think it's actually a good point. Is if you aren't looking back at your work from 5 years ago with a bit of a shake of the head and a bit of disappointment, then we aren't developing. But that said, every now and again we do produce something that
Yeah.
is evergreen, and I would say that is it. And maybe that post isn't as relevant today for Ineos as it might have been at the time. But
No, could be.
I would say for 90% of the listeners or 90% of people, it probably is just as relevant today as it was back then, because we do have a trickle down effect, and the cutting edge is always a little bit ahead of what's probably needed for the masses. So yes, maybe it's developed a little bit, but I think for most people it's still really good. So Aitor, I want to thank you again for your time today, and we will talk to you soon on our next episode in the Energy series. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. See you in the next one.